I'm Harriet, 34 female. I live in a city I love in a condo that I designed myself, and I run a tech company that I built from the ground up with two of my closest friends from college. My life is busy, fulfilling, and by any objective measure, successful. But for most of my life, my family, specifically my aunt's side, has treated me like the designated underdog, the quiet, nerdy girl who would never quite measure up to their golden boy, my cousin Ethan. This year, at Thanksgiving dinner, I decided it was time to update their understanding of my life, not with words, but with a reality so undeniable it would shatter the foundation of their condescending world. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Growing up, Ethan and I were presented to the world as two sides of the same family coin, but everyone knew which side was considered currency and which was just filler. Ethan was the son of my dad's older brother, Uncle Michael, a man who had the Midas touch in real estate, and my Aunt Brenda, a woman who treated social climbing as an Olympic sport. From birth, Ethan was draped in the finest fabrics, enrolled in the most exclusive preschools, and given a life path paved with his parents' gold. While I was learning to ride a second-hand bike with mismatched streamers on the handlebars, Ethan was getting a custom-built go-kart for his 6th birthday. While I was saving up my allowance for a paperback book, Ethan was flying to Europe with his parents for a cultural tour that was really just an excuse for them to shop. My dad, David, was the quieter, more studious brother. He became a civil engineer, a man who found deep satisfaction in building bridges and ensuring the city's infrastructure was sound. He was respected, comfortable, and provided a wonderful, stable home for me and my younger brother, Robert. We never wanted for anything essential, but our lives were a world away from the casual opulence of Ethan's. Our family vacations were camping trips to national parks, not skiing in Aspen. My first car was a reliable 10-year-old sedan that I bought with money from my part-time job, not a brand-new convertible gifted for my 16th birthday like Ethan's. Aunt Brenda made sure we never forgot this disparity. At every family gathering, she would make these backhanded comments disguised as compliments. "Oh, Harriet, it's so wonderful that you're so practical," she'd say, eyeing my department store dress while her own was undoubtedly a designer original. Or she'd turn to my dad and say, "David, you've raised such a resourceful daughter. She really knows how to make the most of things." It was her way of saying we were the poor relations, the B team of the family. Ethan, meanwhile, soaked it all in. He developed a swagger that bordered on arrogance, treating me less like a cousin and more like a court jester he had to tolerate. He'd mock my interest in computers, calling me a keyboard nerd, and telling me I needed to get out more. When I got a scholarship to a great engineering university, he condescendingly told me it was cute that I was following in my dad's footsteps, conveniently ignoring that my field was software, not structural engineering. He, of course, went to an Ivy League school, a legacy admission that his father's hefty donations had secured. My brother Robert saw it all clearly. He was 5 years younger than me and had a fiery sense of justice. He'd often get into quiet arguments with Ethan on my behalf, defending my choices and passions. "She's building things you can't even understand, Ethan," he'd mutter when Ethan made a particularly nasty crack about my coding projects. But I always told Robert to let it go. Arguing with Ethan and Aunt Brenda was like wrestling with a pig in mud. You both get dirty, and the pig enjoys it. I learned early on to simply smile, nod, and retreat into my own world. My world was logical. It was binary. Ones and zeros didn't have ulterior motives or condescending tones. In the clean, structured world of code, I found peace and purpose. While Ethan was out partying his way through college, I was pulling all-nighters in the computer lab, not just completing my assignments, but building my own applications from scratch. I loved the process of creating something out of nothing, of solving a complex problem with an elegant piece of code. The dynamic became even more pronounced after college. Ethan was handed a fancy title, Vice President of Client Relations, at his father's firm. He had a corner office with a view, a 6-figure salary, and a company car. He'd show up to family dinners in perfectly tailored suits, talking loudly about closing deals and managing portfolios, though everyone suspected his primary job was taking his father's clients out for expensive lunches. I, on the other hand, took a junior developer job at a small startup. The pay was modest, the hours were long, and my office was a cubicle in a crowded open-plan space. To Aunt Brenda and Ethan, this was just further proof of my station in life. They saw my long hours and modest apartment as signs of struggle, not ambition. "Don't you worry, dear," Brenda would say with a pitying look. "I'm sure things will pick up for you eventually. Ethan says the market is tough for people without the right connections." I would just smile and say I was happy, which was the truth. I was learning more in a week at that startup than Ethan would learn in a decade of schmoozing. I was on the front lines of innovation, working with brilliant, driven people who were changing the world one line of code at a time. I was exactly where I wanted to be. My dad, bless his heart, was always my steadfast supporter, even if he didn't fully understand the world I was diving into. He'd look at my complex screen of code with a mixture of pride and confusion. "As long as you're happy, Hattie, that's all that matters," he'd say. He never once compared me to Ethan or made me feel like I was falling short of some imaginary family benchmark. My brother Robert was my biggest cheerleader, constantly asking me about my projects and celebrating every small victory. They were my anchors in the sea of my extended family's judgment. Little did any of them know, especially Aunt Brenda and Ethan, that the small startup I was working for was on the verge of something revolutionary. We were developing a new data compression algorithm that was faster and more efficient than anything on the market. And I wasn't just a junior developer anymore. I had become the lead architect of the core technology. The long nights, the hard work, the struggle they pitied me for, it was all about to pay off in a way they couldn't possibly comprehend. The Thanksgiving 2 years before the big one, the one where everything finally came to a head, was what I now refer to as the Thanksgiving ambush. It was the event that planted the seed of my eventual revenge. It wasn't a physical ambush, of course, but a carefully orchestrated social and emotional one, led by none other than my Aunt Brenda, with Ethan as her star player. At the time, I was 32, and the startup I joined out of college had just been acquired by a major tech giant. It wasn't the massive, life-changing exit I would engineer later with my own company, but it was significant. All the employees with stock options, including me, received a respectable payout. For me, it was a little over $500,000 after taxes. It was the most money I had ever seen in my life. It was enough to pay off my student loans, put a hefty down payment on a small condo, and seed the idea for the new company I was already dreaming up. I felt proud, accomplished, and financially secure for the first time. I didn't announce it to the family. It wasn't their business, and frankly, I knew how they'd react. Brenda would find a way to minimize it, and Ethan would find a way to mock it. That year, Thanksgiving was at Aunt Brenda and Uncle Michael's house, a sprawling mansion in the most affluent suburb of the city. Their home was always decorated to perfection, looking like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. As usual, my dad, Robert, and I arrived with a homemade apple pie, which was immediately whisked away by a caterer and placed amongst a dozen other professionally made desserts. We were greeted by Brenda, who gave us air kisses and immediately began her subtle campaign of condescension. She complimented my brother's new haircut by saying it made him look almost professional, and she told my dad he looked rested, a backhanded way of implying he was old and tired. When she got to me, she looked me up and down. I was wearing a nice, simple black dress. "Harriet, dear, that's a very sensible dress. It's good you don't waste your money on frivolous things." I just smiled. "It's comfortable, Aunt Brenda." Dinner was the usual affair, polite conversation punctuated by Ethan's loud bragging. He had just returned from a trip to Monaco, paid for by his company, i.e., his father, and he regaled us with stories of yachts, casinos, and beautiful women. He talked about his new watch, a Rolex that cost more than your car, probably, a comment he directed at me with a smirk. I ignored him and focused on my turkey. But then, as dessert was being served, Aunt Brenda cleared her throat, clinking a spoon against her crystal water glass. "If I could have everyone's attention for a moment," she announced, beaming. The room fell silent. "Michael and I have some wonderful news to share about Ethan." I braced myself. This was their classic move. They always saved their biggest announcements for holidays, ensuring they had a captive audience. "As you all know, Ethan has been working so hard as vice president at the firm," she began, and I had to physically restrain myself from rolling my eyes. "Well, his hard work has paid off. His father has decided to make him a full partner." A round of polite applause went through the room. My dad clapped and offered a sincere "Congratulations, Ethan." My brother gave a tight-lipped smile. Uncle Michael looked as proud as a peacock. Ethan puffed out his chest and gave a magnanimous nod, as if he had just single-handedly solved world hunger. Thank you," he said. "It's a big responsibility, but someone's got to take the reins eventually." But Brenda wasn't done. This was just the opening act. "And with this new partnership," she continued, her voice dripping with sweetness, "Ethan has finally been able to purchase his first home." She paused for dramatic effect. "He just closed on the penthouse at the Grandview downtown." The Grandview was the newest, most expensive luxury condo building in the city. A penthouse there would be a multi-million-dollar property. The implication was clear. This is what real success looked like. A partnership, a penthouse. The kind of success a sensible girl in a practical dress could only dream of. And then came the ambush. Brenda turned her laser-focused gaze on me. "Harriet, I heard your little company got bought out. That's nice. Did you get a little bonus or something?" Her tone was laced with pity, as if she were talking about a child who'd won $5 at a lemonade stand. Before I could even formulate a response, Ethan chimed in, leaning across the table. "Yeah, Harriet, I heard about that. Must be tough. Most of my friends who did the startup thing ended up with nothing." "But hey, at least you got some experience, right?" This was their play. They hadn't brought up my news to congratulate me. They had brought it up to publicly contrast my little bonus with Ethan's penthouse success. They wanted to use my small victory as a footstool to make his seem even grander. I felt my face flush with anger. My $500,000 payout, the result of years of sleepless nights and relentless work, was being dismissed as a little bonus. I saw my brother Robert clench his jaw, ready to jump to my defense. I saw my dad's face fall, a look of discomfort and sadness in his eyes. He hated confrontation, especially with his brother's family. I took a deep breath. I could have told them. I could have said, "Actually, Ethan, my little bonus was enough to buy a place like yours in cash if I wanted to live in a soulless glass box." But I didn't. I knew it wouldn't do any good. They would either call me a liar or twist my words. They didn't want the truth, they wanted to maintain the narrative. So I did what I always did. I gave a small, tight smile. "It was a great experience," I said, my voice calm and even. "I'm really happy for you, Ethan. Congratulations on the new home." Brenda's smile was triumphant. She had won. She had successfully put me in my place and elevated her son. Ethan leaned back in his chair, basking in the glory of his manufactured achievement. The rest of the dinner was a blur. I excused myself as soon as it was politely possible, claiming I had an early morning. My dad and Robert followed me out, their silence speaking volumes. In the car on the way home, Robert finally exploded. "I can't believe them, Harriet. They're unbelievable. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you tell them how much you made?" "Because it wouldn't have mattered, Rob," I said, staring out the window at the passing city lights. "They only hear what they want to hear." My dad sighed from the driver's seat. "I'm sorry, Hattie, I should have said something." "It's okay, Dad," I replied, though it wasn't okay. And as we drove home, a cold, hard resolve began to form in my heart. They wanted a narrative? Fine, I would let them have it for now. But one day, I would write a new ending. An ending so spectacular, so undeniable, that it would leave them speechless. That Thanksgiving ambush was the last time I would ever let them define my success. After the Thanksgiving ambush, I made a conscious decision to pull back from the larger family gatherings. I still saw my dad and brother regularly, of course, but I started making excuses for the big holiday events. I was traveling for work, or I had a major project deadline. It was easier than sitting through another one of Aunt Brenda's condescending performances. For the next year and a half, I put my head down and focused on building my own company. I used the money from the first acquisition as seed capital, brought on my two most trusted colleagues, and we began to build our new platform. Our idea was ambitious: a decentralized, ultra-secure cloud storage system that used our old compression algorithm as a base, but added layers of next-generation encryption. It was niche, highly technical, and had the potential to be revolutionary for industries that handled sensitive data, like finance, healthcare, and defense. During this time, I lived and breathed work. I moved into a slightly larger but still modest apartment, using the living room as our first office. My life was a whirlwind of code, investor pitches, and endless cups of coffee. I didn't have time to think about Ethan or Brenda. The whispers, however, still reached me. My dad would occasionally pass on snippets of information, not maliciously, but just as part of his general family updates. He mentioned that Ethan had bought a new sports car, or that Brenda was chairing another extravagant charity gala. Ethan's company is flying him to Dubai for a conference, he'd say, or Brenda is having the entire house redecorated by some famous designer. Each piece of news was a reminder of the world they lived in, a world where appearances were everything and success was measured in tangible luxuries. The real discovery, the one that reignited the cold fire inside me, came from my brother, Robert. Robert, with his graphic design work, had a wide network of friends in various creative and corporate fields. One evening, about 8 months before the fateful Thanksgiving, he came over to my apartment for pizza. He looked troubled. "Hey, Harriet," he started, picking at a slice of pepperoni. "I heard something weird today. It's about Ethan." I sighed. "Rob, I really don't care what new toy he's bought." "No, it's not that," he said, leaning forward. "It's about his job and his penthouse." Robert's friend, a guy named Sam, was an accountant. Sam's firm had recently been hired to do some auditing work for a bank that handled a lot of high-net-worth clients, including Uncle Michael's real estate firm. Due to the nature of the work, Sam had seen some of the financials. He couldn't share specific details, of course, due to confidentiality agreements, but he had mentioned something to Robert in passing, knowing our family connection. "Sam said that Uncle Michael's company has been taking on a lot of debt," Robert explained, his voice low. "Like, a lot of debt. They've over-leveraged on a couple of massive commercial real estate projects, and with the market softening, they're in a really precarious position." I sat up, suddenly very interested. "Precarious how?" Sam said the words "dangerously close to insolvency" were being thrown around in internal meetings at the bank, Robert said. "And get this. He also said that Ethan's partnership at the company is mostly for show. He draws a huge salary, but he has no real equity. The salary, the car, the penthouse, it's all being financed by company debt. It's part of the image they're trying to project to keep investors confident." I felt a strange, chilling sense of clarity. It all made sense. The constant need to project wealth and success wasn't just arrogance, it was a survival tactic. They weren't just showing off, they were putting on a performance to keep their house of cards from collapsing. The penthouse, the Rolex, the trips to Monaco, it was all a facade, a carefully constructed illusion of prosperity designed to reassure their clients and lenders that everything was fine. "What about the penthouse?" I asked. "Sam said something about that too," Robert continued. "He said the mortgage on it is astronomical, and the loan was co-signed by Uncle Michael's company. If the company goes under, the bank will seize the property immediately. Ethan doesn't really own it, the bank does." I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the city skyline. The Grand View, the building where Ethan had his penthouse, was visible from my apartment, a glittering monument to his supposed success. Now it looked different. It looked like a cage. A gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. All this time they had pitied me. They had looked at my modest apartment, my sensible car, and my work-focused life and seen failure. They had contrasted it with Ethan's flashy lifestyle and seen success. But my life was built on a solid foundation of my own creation, stone by stone, line by line of code. His was built on a mountain of his father's debt. My success was real, tangible, and owned by me. His was a fragile illusion, owned by a bank. The whispers I'd been hearing for years suddenly took on a new meaning. The desperation in Brenda's voice when she boasted about Ethan, the frantic need to host lavish parties, the constant one-upmanship, it was all a show. They weren't just trying to put me down, they were trying to convince themselves. They were shouting their success from the rooftops, because the silence that would follow was the sound of their own financial ruin. "Harriet, you okay?" Robert asked, looking concerned. I turned from the window with a slow smile. "I'm better than okay, Rob," I said. "I'm inspired." He looked confused. "Inspired? By what? The fact that they're secretly broke?" "No," I replied, my mind already starting to spin, connecting dots, forming a plan. "I'm inspired by the opportunity. They've spent their entire lives judging me based on a very specific, very public definition of wealth. I think it's time I showed them what real wealth and real power actually looks like." Robert's eyes widened as he began to understand. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I just smiled. "You'll see," I said. "But first, I need to make a few phone calls, and you and I are going to need to do a little research." The whispers had given me the truth. Now I was going to use that truth to craft my masterpiece. The information from Robert's friend was the spark, but I knew I needed more than just whispers and rumors. If I was going to do what I was planning to do, I needed facts. I needed irrefutable proof. My entire career was built on data and logic, and I wasn't about to base a life-altering decision on second-hand information. It was time to do a deep dive, to apply the same analytical rigor I used for my business to the fragile financial empire of my uncle. My first step was to hire a professional. I reached out to a discreet private financial investigation firm, one that specialized in corporate due diligence. I explained the situation in broad strokes. I was a potential investor looking to understand the financial health of a prominent local real estate firm, my uncle's company, Michael Sterling Properties. I didn't mention the family connection. I wanted their report to be completely objective, untainted by emotion or personal history. I paid their hefty retainer without blinking. It was an investment in clarity. While they got to work digging through public records, loan documents, and market analyses, Robert and I started our own, more subtle investigation. Robert, the graphic designer, was a master of social media. He started tracking the online presence of Ethan and Brenda with a new, analytical eye. He wasn't just looking at the flashy photos, he was looking at the metadata, the geotags, the patterns. He cross-referenced Ethan's business trips with his social media posts, finding that most of them were little more than glorified vacations, with maybe one token business lunch thrown in for appearances. He noticed that Aunt Brenda, who used to post photos from a different high-end boutique every other day, had suddenly stopped. Her posts were now mostly throwbacks to past events or carefully staged photos from inside her home. It was a subtle shift, but it suggested a tightening of the belt, a reduction in casual spending. Meanwhile, I focused on the properties themselves. My dad, being a civil engineer for the city, had access to a wealth of public information about zoning, permits, and construction projects. I asked him, under the guise of being curious about local development, to pull the files on the two large commercial projects that Robert's friend had mentioned. My dad was happy to oblige, pleased that I was taking an interest in his line of work. The files were dense and technical, but I pored over them every night. What I found was alarming. Michael Sterling Properties had taken out massive construction loans to finance these projects, betting on the idea that they could pre-lease most of the commercial space before construction was complete. But the documents showed that occupancy rates were shockingly low. They had built two massive, gleaming glass towers that were sitting mostly empty. The interest payments on those loans alone must have been crippling. A week later, the initial report from the financial investigators landed in my secure inbox. It was 100 pages of dense, dry analysis, and I read every single word. It confirmed everything Robert's friend had said and more. The report painted a grim picture of a company that had expanded too aggressively, fueled by debt and ego. It detailed the loans, the high interest rates, the missed leasing targets. It highlighted a pattern of borrowing from one project to cover the operational shortfalls of another, a classic corporate shell game. But the most damning section was about executive compensation. The report noted that despite the company's poor performance and mounting debt, the salaries and bonuses for the top executives, namely my uncle and my cousin, had remained astronomically high. They were essentially siphoning money from a sinking ship to fund their lavish lifestyles. Ethan's penthouse, his sports car, his designer suits, it was all being paid for with borrowed money that the company had no realistic way of repaying. They weren't just bad at business, they were actively draining their own company dry. The final piece of the puzzle came from a source I never expected. My dad mentioned one evening that he'd run into his brother, Michael, at the grocery store. "He looked terrible, Hattie," my dad said, his brow furrowed with concern. Stressed, he asked me if I knew any good financial advisors. I gave him the name of my guy, but it was strange. "Your uncle has always been so proud, so sure of himself." This was it. The pride was cracking. Uncle me. Cale was looking for a lifeline. He knew he was in trouble, deep trouble. He was looking for a way out, and that's when my plan began to crystallize, shifting from a vague idea of revenge into a concrete, actionable strategy. I wasn't just going to expose them. That was too simple, too crude. I was going to become their solution, their savior, and in doing so, I would take everything. I spent the next few weeks on the phone with my own lawyers and wealth managers, the team that had helped me structure my own company and manage the fortune it was generating. My tech company had, in the past year, secured 2 major contracts with a Fortune 500 company and the Department of Defense. Our valuation had skyrocketed. On paper, and soon to be in reality after our next round of funding closed, my net worth was about to cross the $50 million mark. It was a number so large it felt abstract, but I was about to make it very, very real. I instructed my legal team to set up a new, anonymously named shell corporation. Its purpose: to acquire distressed commercial real estate debt. I started transferring funds into its accounts, preparing for the first and only acquisition it would ever make. I told my lawyers to approach the primary lending bank for Michael Sterling Properties with an offer. I wanted to buy the debt on his 2 failing commercial towers, all of it. Banks, especially when they fear a major default is on the horizon, are often happy to sell off risky debt at a discount to cut their losses. They don't care who buys it as long as the buyer's money is good, and my money was very good. The trap was being set. The beauty of it was that they would never see me coming. They were looking for a life raft, and I was about to offer them one. They would have no idea that the captain of their rescue ship was the very person they had spent a lifetime looking down on. The next 6 months were a masterclass in patience and precision. While my lawyers and financial team worked behind the scenes, I had to play a part. The unassuming, slightly out-of-her-depth tech nerd my family had always believed me to be. The timing was critical. My company was in the final stages of closing a massive Series C funding round, which would formalize our new valuation and flood our corporate accounts, and by extension, my own, with liquid capital. The deal was set to close the week before Thanksgiving. Everything was aligning perfectly. The first major step was the debt acquisition. My shell corporation, named the Northwood Asset Group to sound as bland and corporate as possible, made its offer to the bank. As predicted, the bank, terrified of having to foreclose on 2 half-empty skyscrapers and take a massive loss, was eager to negotiate. They saw Northwood as a vulture fund willing to take on the risk. After a few weeks of back and forth, we settled on a price. I bought my uncle's nearly $80 million in debt for a discounted price of $45 million. The transaction was silent, buried in financial paperwork. To my uncle, the only thing that changed was the name on the letters he received. His debt was no longer owed to a familiar bank, but to a faceless entity called Northwood. He probably thought he'd dodged a bullet, assuming a specialized group had taken over, perhaps seeing value he couldn't unlock. He had no idea the group was his niece. Now that I was effectively his lender, I controlled his fate. I could call in the loans, force him into bankruptcy, and seize the properties at any moment. But that wasn't the plan. A hostile takeover was messy and public. I wanted something more elegant, more personal. I wanted him to hand me the keys himself. So, I had Northwood do the opposite of what he expected. Instead of applying pressure, we offered him a lifeline. My lawyers, acting as representatives of Northwood, sent a letter to my uncle proposing a meeting. They offered new, more favorable terms for his debt, a lower interest rate, a more flexible payment schedule. All he had to do was agree to a restructuring plan and provide a full, transparent audit of his company's finances. For a man drowning, it was the ultimate life raft. He agreed immediately, no questions asked. He likely felt an overwhelming sense of relief, believing some anonymous fund had seen the long-term potential in his properties and was willing to work with him. The irony was so thick I could taste it. He was opening his books and his company to the very person he had spent years dismissing. While this was happening, I had to maintain the facade with my family. My dad called me a few weeks before Thanksgiving. "Good news, Hattie," he said, his voice cheerful. "Your Uncle Michael seems to be doing much better. He said some investment group bought his bank loans and they're helping him restructure. He sounded more optimistic than he has in years." "That's great, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly even. "I'm glad to hear it." The final piece of the plan involved Ethan. Through the audit my uncle had so willingly provided, I now had a clear picture of every dollar flowing in and out of Michael Sterling Properties. I saw Ethan's inflated salary, his exorbitant expense account, and the company funds used to lease his sports car and pay the mortgage on his penthouse. It was all there in black and white. With this information, I had my team draft a second proposal. Northwood Asset Group was prepared to inject a significant amount of capital, $10 million, directly into Michael Sterling Properties to help them lease the empty spaces and become profitable. This would save the company and, by extension, the family's reputation. There were, however, conditions. The first condition was that my uncle Michael would have to step down as CEO. He could remain as a figurehead president, but a new CEO, appointed by Northwood, would take over all operational and financial control. The second condition was that all non-essential executive positions would be eliminated to cut costs. This included, specifically, the vice president of client relations. Ethan would be fired. The third and final condition was that all company-funded personal assets would be liquidated to pay down the debt. This included the lease on Ethan's car and, most importantly, the company-backed mortgage on his penthouse. He would lose everything his success was built on. My lawyers presented this offer to my uncle 1 week before Thanksgiving. They told him to take the holiday to think it over with his family. It was a brutal deal, but it was also his only way out. The alternative was Northwood calling in the loans and him losing everything anyway, but in a much more public and humiliating bankruptcy. I had him backed into a corner, and he knew it. That week, my own company's funding round officially closed. The money hit the bank. The wire transfer notification on my phone read a sum with so many zeros I had to look at it twice. It was real. I was, for all intents and purposes, worth over $50 million. I felt a quiet, profound sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the freedom, the power, the ability to reshape my own world and, as it turned out, the world of those who had belittled me. I called my dad to confirm I'd be there for Thanksgiving. He was thrilled. "Oh, Hattie, it will be so good to have you." Brenda called earlier. She said Michael is a bit stressed about a business deal, but she's sure it will all work out. She wants to make a special announcement at dinner. I almost smiled. I had a feeling I knew what that announcement would be. They were going to accept my deal. They were going to announce the rescue of their company by some benevolent investment group. They would try to spin it as a victory, a testament to their resilience. They had no idea I would be sitting at the table with them. They had no idea their savior was the girl in the sensible dress, and I had an announcement of my own to make. Thanksgiving Day arrived, crisp and cold. I drove to Aunt Brenda's house, not in my usual practical sedan, but in a new car. It wasn't flashy like Ethan's, but it was a statement. A sleek, dark gray, all-electric luxury sedan that was silent, powerful, and understated. It cost more than his sports car, but you wouldn't know it unless you knew what you were looking at. I parked it right behind his obnoxiously loud, bright red convertible in the driveway. I walked to the door and took a deep breath. Showtime. I was greeted by the same fanfare as always. Brenda gave me a distracted air kiss, her eyes scanning my outfit. I had chosen it carefully. A simple, elegant cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. Expensive, but not loud. "Harriet, you made it. We were so worried your work would get in the way again," she said, her voice tight with forced pleasantry. I could see the stress behind her eyes. The atmosphere in the house was thick with tension. Uncle Michael looked pale and was nursing a glass of scotch. Ethan was trying to project his usual bravado, but it was brittle. He was louder than usual, his jokes falling flat. He tried to poke at me, of course. "Hey, Harriet, still driving that old tin can?" he asked, gesturing towards the driveway. "Actually, I got a new car," I said calmly. "The gray one." He glanced out the window, a flicker of confusion on his face. He didn't recognize the model, so he couldn't immediately assign a price tag to it. It threw him off. I just smiled and walked into the living room to greet my dad and Robert. Robert gave me a knowing look, a small, encouraging smile. He was the only one who knew the full extent of what was about to happen. We sat down for dinner. The conversation was stilted. Uncle Michael and Aunt Brenda were clearly just waiting for the right moment to make their announcement. Finally, after the main course was cleared, my uncle stood up, his hand trembling slightly as he raised his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he began. He cleared his throat. "As some of you know, the last year has been challenging for the business, but our family is resilient. We have always found a way to persevere." He then launched into a carefully rehearsed speech about a strategic partnership with a forward-thinking investment group called Northwood. He explained that they were injecting capital and restructuring for future growth. He framed it as a massive victory, a brilliant business move on his part. He announced he would be stepping into a new role as president, allowing a new CEO to handle the day-to-day. Aunt Brenda was beaming, looking around the table, daring anyone to see this as anything other tea. "Hannah triumph, and while there will be some changes," she chimed in, looking at Ethan with a sad but proud smile. "Ethan has decided that after years of dedicated service, he's going to take some time off to explore new ventures." So that was the spin, taking time off, not being fired as a condition of the bailout. It was perfect. They finished their announcement, and a wave of polite applause followed. My dad looked relieved for his brother. Uncle Michael sat down, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He had done it. He had saved face. He thought the worst was over. Now it was my turn. I let the applause die down. Then I gently cleared my throat. All eyes turned to me. "That's wonderful news, Uncle Michael, Aunt Brenda," I said, my voice quiet but clear, cutting through the lingering chatter. "I'm so glad to hear that Michael Sterling Properties has found a partner in Northwood Asset Group. I've heard good things about them." My uncle looked surprised that I even knew the name. "Yes, they're a very sharp group," he said, puffing out his chest a bit. "Very professional." "I agree," I said, taking a small sip of water. "I should know I own them." The silence that fell over the table was absolute. It was so complete that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My uncle stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. Aunt Brenda's painted-on smile froze and then began to crumble. Ethan just looked confused, as if I'd started speaking in a foreign language. My dad's fork clattered onto his plate. He looked from me to his brother, his face a mask of pure shock. What did you just say?" Uncle Michael stammered. "I said I own Northwood Asset Group," I repeated, my voice calm and steady. "It's a holding company I formed a few months ago. I bought your debt from the bank. I drafted the restructuring proposal. The new CEO they're appointing, he works for me. The $10 million of capital being injected into your company, it's my money." I let the words hang in the air, each one landing like a physical blow. Aunt Brenda's face went from pale to a blotchy red. That's not possible," she whispered. You work with computers." Then Ethan finally processed it. His face twisted into a sneer of disbelief. You're lying. You couldn't afford to buy my dad's company. You live in a tiny apartment." "My apartment is quite nice, actually," I said pleasantly. "But you're right, I couldn't afford to buy the company with my salary. Luckily, I don't have to. The tech company I founded a few years ago, the one you all thought was just a little hobby, just closed a funding round that valued it at over $400 million. My personal net worth, Ethan, is now a little over $50 million. That was the number that broke him. $50 million. Ethan's face contorted, disbelief warring with a dawning, horrified understanding. All the years of mockery, the condescending remarks, the smug superiority, it all crashed down on him at once. He, the golden boy, was being fired from his sham job and losing his fake rich lifestyle because of a deal made by the keyboard nerd cousin he had spent his life belittling. And she had done it with an amount of money he couldn't even comprehend. He shot to his feet, his chair screeching back against the hardwood floor. "No," he screamed, his voice cracking. "I don't believe you, you're making it all up, Dad, she's lying." Uncle Michael was speechless, his face ashen. He knew I wasn't lying. He had signed the papers. He just never knew who was on the other side. "Sit downethan?" Aunt Brenda shrieked, her own composure completely gone. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a venomous hatred I had never seen before. "You did this to us, your own family. Why?" "Why?" I asked, my voice finally taking on a hard edge. "You want to know why? Because for 30 years you have used every single family gathering to remind me of my place. You mocked my ambition, belittled my success, and taught your son that he was inherently better than me because he was born into money he didn't earn. You never saw me, you only saw what you wanted to see, the poor relation. You judged my life based on the car I drove and the dress I wore, not on my character or my accomplishments." I turned to Ethan, who was shaking with rage. "You lose your job, your car, and your penthouse, Ethan, because they were never yours to begin with. They were props in a play, financed by debt. I'm just calling the curtain." Ethan let out a strangled sob, a sound of pure, wounded pride. He kicked his chair, sending it clattering to the floor, and stormed out of the dining room, slamming the front door behind him. We could hear the roar of his sports car as he peeled out of the driveway. Aunt Brenda buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Uncle Michael just sat there, staring into space, a broken man. And my dad just sat there in total ut. Our shock, looking at the daughter, he suddenly realized he didn't know at all. The silence that followed Ethan's dramatic exit was heavier than any argument could ever be. Aunt Brenda's sobbing was the only sound in the opulent dining room, a stark contrast to the triumphant atmosphere she had tried to create just moments before. My uncle looked like a statue, his face gray and empty. He hadn't said another word. My dad finally turned to me, his eyes wide with 1,000 questions. "Harriet, is this true, all of it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded. "Yes, Dad, all of it. 50 million?" He trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. He wasn't upset, just completely overwhelmed. He had always been proud of me, but he had measured my success in terms he understood. A good job, a happy life. This level of wealth was something from another universe. My brother Robert, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with a grim satisfaction, finally spoke up. He looked at my aunt and uncle with cold disdain. "You know," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "For years, all I've heard is how much better you are than us, how much more you have. Turns out, the only thing you had more of was debt and hypocrisy." That seemed to snap Brenda out of her hysterics. She lifted her head, her makeup-streaked face contorted with fury. "Get out," she hissed at me, her voice trembling. "Get out of my house. Both of you," she added, glaring at Robert. "Gladly," Robert said, pushing his chair back. I stood up calmly. I had said everything I needed to say. As I walked towards the door, my dad stood up to join us. He gave his brother one last, long, searching look, a mixture of pity and disappointment in his eyes, and then followed us out without a word. The three of us got into my new, silent car and drove away, leaving the ruins of their Thanksgiving dinner behind us. The car ride was quiet at first. My dad just stared out the window, processing. Finally, he turned to me. "Why didn't you ever tell me, Hattie, about your company, about how successful it was?" "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it," I said honestly. "And I guess I didn't want you to worry or for things to get weird. I'm still just me, Dad." He reached over and put a hand on my shoulder. "I am so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not because of the money, but because you built something incredible all on your own. You never cease to amaze me." Robert grinned from the back seat. "She's a shark, Dad. They were swimming in her water and never even knew it." I laughed, and the tension finally broke. We went back to my dad's house, ordered pizzas, and spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking for the first time in years about my work, my life, and the future. It felt like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. In the weeks that followed, the changes were swift and decisive. The new CEO I appointed for Michael Sterling Properties was a ruthless but brilliant turnaround specialist. He cleaned house, cutting all the fat, which included the remnants of Ethan's expense accounts and Brenda's company-funded charity events. Ethan's car was repossessed, and he was forced to vacate the penthouse. I heard through the grapevine that he moved back in with his parents. He refused to speak to anyone on our side of the family. Uncle Michael, now a president in name only, was forced to watch as his company was dismantled and rebuilt into something lean, efficient, and, for the first time in a long time, potentially profitable. I had no interest in running a real estate empire, so my long-term plan was to stabilize the company and then sell it, recouping my initial investment and then some. My revenge was never about destroying them financially. It was about destroying their false sense of superiority. It was about taking away the unearned pedestal they had stood on to look down on me. My relationship with my dad and brother became stronger than ever. My dad retired from his civil engineering job a few months later. I set up a trust fund for him that would ensure he could live the rest of his life in comfort, traveling and pursuing his hobbies without a single financial worry. He resisted at first, being a man of immense pride, but I convinced him to see it not as a handout, but as a dividend on the investment he had made in me his entire life. Robert's graphic design business also got a boost. I became his silent partner, investing in his company so he could hire a team and take on bigger clients. He was brilliant, and all he had ever needed was the capital to match his talent. As for me, my life didn't change dramatically on the surface. I still ran my company, I still lived in my condo, and I still loved the quiet, logical world of code. But something inside me had settled. The chip on my shoulder, the one placed there by years of condescension, was finally gone. The store. If that Thanksgiving became a quiet legend in our small circle. It was the day the family narrative was irrevocably rewritten. It wasn't about money versus no money. It was about earned versus unearned. It was about substance versus facade. And in the end, substance had won. I had spent so much of my life in their shadow, but it turned out to be the perfect place to grow. Because while they were busy tending to their image in the blinding sun, I was in the shadows, quietly building an empire.